So thank you for having me today. Super excited to share some of our experience here at Yotpo. Try to build it in a super practical manner. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. So a few words about Yotpo before we start. So Yotpo is an e-commerce marketing platform. We offer integrated solution for SMS marketing, loyalty and referrals programs, rating reviews, and visual UGC. Operating globally today, we have 6 offices, over 800 employees, raised more than $400 million to date. A few words about our go-to-market approach in general. So at Yotpo, our strategy is based on 3 main dimensions. First of all, Yotpo is a multi-customer segment. That means that we sell and service VSB, SMB, mid-market, and enterprise customers. The second bucket is multi-geo, which means that we are operating globally, again, selling and servicing via the local go-to-market teams, and that's the key here. And the last point is that Yotpo is also a multi-product company. We are selling multiple or different type of products, mostly to the same buyer persona. This is what guides the way we are structuring the go-to-market teams at Yotpo. But today specifically, I'm going to put more focus on the way we approach the customer segmentation, as I believe it's more relevant to most of the companies. So how to scale up the CS org? I think that's the biggest question. In the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through the way our CS organization at Yotpo evolved over time, and more specifically, how we build a sustainable CS organization with great economics and great CRC, customer retention cost. So before we speak about the playbook, just to share a little bit about the way our CS org looked like back when I joined Yotpo about 5 years ago. I think it's a great way to describe the typical CS organization at the early stage. I think the first thing was that our CSMs were leveraged as kind of like a one-stop shop resource, which means that the CSMs at Yotpo, and I think in most companies at the early stage, owns the entire customer journey from onboarding to optimizing the customer, renewing customers, building the relationship, and so on and so forth. There are many companies that at early stage are already having retention teams or sales teams that own the retention conversations or the upsells and cross-sells activities. But in our case, it was different from the get-go. Another thing that I think characterizes CSM organizations at early stage is that normally CSMs have a very diversified book of business. It means it's like the same CSM is managing both 5K customers and 40K customers. That comes with many challenges we'll speak about in the next few slides. Approach, generally speaking, is relatively reactive in the sense that the CSM's time is mostly consumed for addressing issues and questions coming from the different customers. And it's less about being super methodical in applying a more proactive approach that can drive more success with the customers. And the last point is that the customer journey sometimes doesn't exist at this stage. Sometimes it does exist, but it's very not optimized for obvious reasons. I think that with that operational environment, there are 2 main challenges. The first one is that there is misalignment between the CS investment and the CS cost spend to the potential of the customers or the size of the customers. If you think about it, if I'm a CSM and I'm managing different type of customers at different sizes, it's more than likely that I will find myself dealing mostly with the lower end customers, the smaller ones that are typically having less resources, require much more hands-on approach, more price sensitive, and hence in a very weird way, I'm spending most of the time dealing with these customers rather than working with the larger customers that are supposed to have much larger opportunity for the long term. It also means that it's very difficult, almost impossible to transition the customer success function from being very reactive to be proactive, because again, most of the time is spent on addressing very demanding smaller customers that are coming to you over and over again, expecting you to do everything for them. In order to solve those issues or those challenges, we took a very gradual approach to transition the CS organization from the way it used to be to the way we're operating today. And I'm going to use the next few slides to walk you through the key changes that we made. Needless to say, there were other changes that we did, but the ones that I'm going to cover are supposed to capture most of the things that I believe any CS organization needs to take into account to the very least. So starting with the first step, we introduced a tiering model. That basically means that we divided our customer base into several customer segments. Based on the customer profile, normally you are doing it based on AOV or potential growth of the customer. The easiest way to do it is, again, based on the size of the customer. But the key here is to make sure that you are grouping similar customers under the same bucket. Once you are segmenting the customers, the next step is basically to define a different customer journey for each one of these customer segments. When I'm saying customer journey, I'm referring to number of proactive touch points and type of touch points that we expect the CSM to have with each one of the customers. Just like to illustrate that, that's like a typical customer journey for an SMB customer at Yotpo. You can see that we are dividing our customer journey into three main phases. We have the onboarding phase, the optimization phase, and the renewal phase. If we take a look at the optimization phase in particular, you can see that like CSMs are expected to deliver 2 optimization calls, 2 QBRs, and obviously for mid-market customers, the number of proactive touch points will be higher. For VSP customers, it will be the opposite. It could be in-person meetings. In some cases, it could be via email and so on and so forth. So now we have customer segmentation, and we also defined a clear customer journey for each one of the segments. The next step is to align the CSM teams to the customer segments that we just built. And it's very important because if we just having the customer segment and the customer journey, but we're still operating in a way where each one of the CSMs is managing both small customers and large customers, the problem of paying too much attention to the smaller customers repeat itself, and the CSMs won't be able to execute the theoretical playbook in which is supposed to expect to spend much more time with the larger customers. Hence, the solution is to make sure that we are assigning CSMs to specific customer segment. So for example, we will have CSMs that are managing only SMB customers. We will have CSMs that are managing only mid-market customers. And that's basically the key. In order for us to do that, there are 2 forces that we need to take into account that can potentially contradict each other. The first one is the total ACV managed by each one of the CSMs. I think that's like one of the more frequent questions that I'm being asked over and over again is like how much in ACV each one of the CSMs is supposed to manage. And I think the answer here is like very different for different type of companies that are operating in different environment with different customer segments and also related to the stage of the company. But I would say like the number here is acceptable, depends on where you are as a company. It could be $1 million, it could be $2 million, it could be $3 million. But another consideration to take into account, as I said before, is the number of accounts that we expect the CSMs to manage. There should be like a reasonable number of accounts that CSM is managing, or else it won't be possible for the CSM to execute the playbook that we expect the CSM to execute. Let's take like a numeric example. Let's say that we want each one of the CSMs to manage $2 million in total ACV. We want the CSMs to be very proactive with their customers and speak with them on a monthly basis. And we also know that the AOV per customer is 5K. In that case, we basically expect the CSM to manage 400 accounts and be very proactive with these customers throughout the customer journey. I think it's obviously like it's impossible to manage 400 accounts on a monthly basis with this AOV. So the key here is to find the right balance between the total ACV managed and number of accounts. And oftentimes the right way to do that is to segment the customers in a way that will make sense from a unit economic standpoint, at least at the first stage. Another consideration that should be taken here is the profile of the CSM. I think there is like a different philosophy for that, but I would argue that different type of customers require different type of CSMs. Going back to this example, if the CSM is managing 400 accounts, I think the key skill set that we will expect to see from the CSM are very different than what we'll expect to see from a CSM that is managing only 20 accounts. In the first case, we will have to see more a project management type of a skill set, great prioritization skill set, whereas I would argue that like for the larger customers, you need a much more commercially oriented person to manage much more complex relationship with multiple stakeholders. So we have a customer segmentation. We have a predefined customer journey for different customer segments. We aligned the CSM teams with the customer segments. And the next question to be asked is how we are making sure that this theoretical playbook is actually executed. We'll take like an example. I'm an SMB CSM. I'm managing 100 accounts. And I'm expected to deliver monthly touch points for these accounts. How I know when I'm starting my day, if I need to speak today with customer number 26, number 27, number 73, whether it needs to be an optimization call or renewal call and so on and so forth. One way to do it that probably won't work is to work with like Excel sheets. A better way to do it is to implement a CSM platform. We are at Yotpo using Gainsight. There are other vendors out there with pros and cons. But the key here is that this platform structures the customer journey for the CSMs. So each CSM knows every day what specific call to actions need to be taken with each one of the customers that are part of this portfolio. By doing that, we can actually execute this predefined customer journey that we just defined. We can also enable a much more proactive approach because by having this platform, we can also start collecting some interesting signals that will enable us to add another layer of proactivity coming from the CSMs, and I'm going to elaborate on that in the next few slides. And I'm going to elaborate on that in the next few slides. The next thing that happens once you have like a system in place is that you can ensure consistency among the CSMs. We want to make sure that similar customers are getting the same experience, same level of services, and it can't happen if you don't have that platform in place. And last but not least, and I'm putting my operator hat for a second, I think it's very important to use these platforms because it gives us great visibility into what happens between the CSMs and the customers. We can measure the type of activities and the number of activities that each one of the CSMs are having with their customers. We can see how many call to action are open per CSM. We can make different type of comparisons between the CSMs and have like really great visibility into what's going on with the customers, and over time optimize the customer journey by collecting these different type of signals. So we have CSMs that are assigned now to customer journey. We have system in place that can help us execute our playbook. The next step is to start adding some interesting automations, leveraging the system that we have. A nice example of that could be a post-onboarding survey that we are using at Yotpo. Once the customer is deployed, it automatically triggers a survey for the customer in which we are asking to get feedback on the way we set expectations, the level of service, product gaps, and so on and so forth. By doing that, we are able to identify issues with customers at early stage that we can fix to make sure the customers will be back on track. We can also identify super satisfied customers that could be potentially cross-sold later on in the customer journey, since we know there is a very high correlation between level of satisfaction in the onboarding stage and the ability to grow the customers and of course to retain them. Another example would be NPS. We are triggering NPS every 6 months for each one of our customers based on where they are in their journey. And that gives us another visibility into the sentiment of the customers. NPS is another great operational tool, by the way. We are collecting the NPS. We can trigger via the platform call to action to the CSM to reach out the customer and follow up based on the feedback that we received. It could be about the service, product, and so on and so forth. It also gives great visibility into leadership, so we know exactly what is more common when it comes to customers and their lack of satisfaction. Another thing that we can do by leveraging like automations is to start building like some triggers that are based on customer behaviors. I'll give you like a few examples. If we see, for example, that like the customer is not engaging with our platform after X days, that could trigger automatically a call to action to the CSM to reach out. If we see that there was an increase in the number of orders that customer is collecting, that can indicate that the customer is growing. That will create or will trigger call to action to the CSM to reach out the customer and see if there is an opportunity to grow the customer. There are many types of like risk and opportunities. Everything is predefined based on the interesting behaviors that we mapped at Yotpo. Just like to summarize where we are in the journey, we segmented our customers. We have CSMs that are working with specific customer segments. We have system in place. We have automations in place. So I think we can argue at this stage that we have a very nice machine of CSMs. What is important to do at this stage is to start challenging yourself with regards to the initial assumptions that we made when we build when we built the customer journey. If, for example, we made an assumption that an SMB customer will require monthly touch points, maybe it's not the case. After a while, you can start seeing what type of activities are moving the needle, what type of activities are less required, how it varies from one customer segment to another, and so on and so forth. So that's like an opportunity to start reducing the number of proactive touch points, sometimes increasing the number of proactive touch points for specific customer segment. It's also a great time to start asking yourself whether the type of proactive touch points make sense. Do you really need an in-person meeting with an SMB customer, as an example? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and so on and so forth. At each stage, I think it also makes sense to start entertaining the concept of building expertise within the customer journey and transitioning from the world where CSM is doing everything to a world where we start building different experts for different stages in the customer journey. I will argue that the CSM is not set up for success. If we expect the CSM to be a great onboarding person, that sometimes comes with requirements to be very technically oriented, a very strong like a project manager, versus building relationship, versus renewing customers, versus upselling and cross-selling customers. And that's like the time where it makes sense to start changing that very kind of like a one-stop shop approach. Just by doing this fine-tuning, we're already starting to touch cost optimization of the organization. But if you think about it, we can take a much more methodical approach into optimizing the CS costs, leveraging different type of levers that we might have. And just like named a few here, but there are many more. So I'll just give you like a few examples, starting with like thinking or differentiating first-year customers versus second-plus-year customers. Let's take a look here. This is again an SMB customer journey in the first year. Again, as I said before, we have the onboarding phase, we have the optimization phase, and the renewal phase. And again, you can see that in the optimization phase, we have 4 proactive touch points that CSMs is doing, 2 optimization calls and 2 QBRs. When we're moving on to the second year, you don't really need 2 QBRs and 2 optimization calls. We are left with only 1 optimization call. However, to remind you, we also have the system in place, so we are able to identify specific customer behaviors that can trigger a call to action to the CSM whenever it is needed. So I wouldn't say that we are connecting with customers only once a year. I will say it like that's like the proactive playbook that we are applying, but we are using a lot of like sophisticated automations to make sure that the right customers are getting the right attention, knowing that it won't be sustainable to apply the same customer journey over and over again, no matter how advanced the customer is in terms of his journey with us over time. Another level that we have is local CSMs. I think most of the companies, their playbook is to have CSMs that are aligned with the time zone of the customers that are servicing. So for example, it makes sense to have CSMs that are based in US to manage US customers. I think it's right. However, I will argue that like over time, you need to ask yourself if it's still true. Knowing that some of the customers, and of course it depends on the type of products and type of customer segments, but we know at Yotpo, for example, that like there are certain type of customers that in the second year, in the third year, they don't really require a lot of CSM attention. They are in kind of like autopilot mode, fully deployed. Our CSMs are chasing them and they don't want to speak with us. So that's a great opportunity to start considering transitioning these customers to lower cost geo. What we're doing at Yotpo, we are managing many of our EST customers via Israel, mostly customers that have been with us for at least 2 years, for example, very satisfied, and we're taking like the most sophisticated approach that I mentioned before. Another interesting concept that we are leveraging at Yotpo is what we call super CSM. We took our long tail customers that have been with us for a few good years, super satisfied, paying relatively like much less when it comes to AOV. And we transitioned them to one CSM that is working in a very surgical manner based on different type of triggers that we are creating. He's managing now today 500 accounts. These accounts were managed in the past by 5 different CSMs, each one managed 100 accounts. and retention numbers actually went up since we implemented that change, and costs became much lower, of course. Another thing that I want to elaborate now is to start considering like a lower cost resources in general. CS cost is comprised of also like a support, professional services, deployment costs. We at some point started outsourcing some of the tasks that don't really require a high level of expertise to the Philippines, for example. So technical support, some of the professional services aspects, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, we have like a customer marketing, which is a very powerful tool that can replace some of the interactions that CSMs are having with the customers, pushing for more education, optimizing features, leveraging other features that are not leveraging, pushing for cross-sales opportunities, and so on and so forth. I think many organizations are putting a lot of focus on predicting sales, whereas predicting churn is as important, if not more important, over time. What we did, we basically are taking a hybrid approach. We have data model that is based on different parameters that we found very highly correlated with retention numbers of customers. And we're running this regression to predict how churn is going to look like. So in fact, we can predict the churn for the next year in a world where we don't see any product changes or operational changes. On top of that, and this is the complementary side, we have a bottom-up CSM prediction approach in which each one of the CSMs is required to predict whether customers are going to renew or not. And they need to put also like an ACV prediction for each one of the customers, factoring in potential downsell or upsell. By cross-referencing these two models, we can see we can get great prediction and to understand how the numbers are going to look like in the next few quarters. That's a great methodology to provide the leadership with some interesting tools that can help them manage the operations in a much better manner. For example, if I know that we have certain customers that are predicted as no by the CSMs, that's the time to start building like an attack plan to fix that and making sure that as many of them are converted into yes. We're also getting like a commitment for the CSM leadership. I'm getting from the VP of CSM at Yotpo, L commits for retention numbers. She's getting commits from area leaders and so on and so forth. You can see how we are breaking down the different customer segments. You can see it by number of employees, but we're also looking at the revenue of the customer. Generally speaking, in VSB, we don't have CS resources with the exception of technical support. In SMB, you can see that we have yearly packages. You can see the AOV. The CSM book of business varies, could be 1 to 75 accounts, could be 1 to 350. I guess, again, based on the things that I mentioned before, we have an onboarding manager for the onboarding phase. CSMs are owning the optimization and the upsells. Account management are doing the cross-sells, and CSM is the one renewing. Obviously, with larger customers with higher level of complexity, we are breaking down the different experts further. So you can see it like onboarding. We have solution engineers, a more technical resource in comparison to the onboarding manager. CSMs are still owning the optimization, but account managers are also involved in upsells activities and of course owning the cross-sell activities. And renewal is also done oftentimes by the account manager. Again, given the more commercial nature of the relationship. Enterprise, exactly the same, but even with higher level of involvement coming from the account manager. Again, given the level of complexity, the commercial complexity with these customers. So just to summarize the transition from Subscale to Scalable organization, we started with like a CSM that supported the entire customer journey, what we defined as one-stop shop. Book of business was very diversified. CSMs found themselves managing very small customers and very large customers, and the service model was very reactive. Today, we have different resources that are assigned to different stages within the customer journey. We are taking like a tiering model with segmentation and different customer journey for each one of these segments. The service is very proactive when it is needed, of course. We have a CSM platform, automations, predictions, and we also have a different type of KPIs. Didn't cover it today. That's probably for a different topic. The way we are structuring the CS comp is as follows. 80% is base and 20% is variable that is based on performance. However, when we're saying variable, we are looking at the entire performance of a certain tier. So we have like a ladder for the SMB, a different ladder for mid-market with different net retention and logo retention numbers. You can see here that generally speaking, 40% is given for logo retention, 40% for net retention. We are changing the weights, by the way, based on the size of the customer. So larger customers will put more focus on the net retention number, given the fact that we know that it makes more sense. So it's more than possible to grow these customers as opposed to very small customers that are very price sensitive and are less likely to use more of our products. And we have another component, which is a personal component, and that's basically the number of cross-sells that CSMs are pushing. They also have it's based on ladder. And for that one in particular, we are compensating CSMs based on their personal performance. But that's the entire 100% of the comp. Can speak a little bit about the different considerations, why we're looking at the entire customer segment and not just personal, but very high level. I think as opposed to say, it's very important to make sure that CSMs are very collaborative with each other to leverage knowledge. And it's also a different nature of people oftentimes. When we introduced this structure, it wasn't that easy to implement. Some of the CSMs were very much against that. I think there are other organizations in general that are taking a different approach where they are disconnecting the CSMs for renewal conversations from upsell responsibilities and so on and so forth. We found that model much more, much stronger in the sense that it made the CSMs much more accountable for the results of the accounts. And we started seeing many more upsells and cross-sell activities, and also retention numbers obviously went up, logo retention included. Onboarding manager, that is again the resource that is responsible for deploying the customers. We're measuring different aspects. The first one is time to deploy, which is a key, of course, and more importantly, the level of customer satisfaction that is coming post-deployment that we are collecting via the service that I mentioned before. Account managers at Yotpo are operating just like sales, 50-50 base variable. They have revenue target that they need to go after. The only difference between them and account executives is they are targeting our existing customer base. And that's the main difference there. Just to clarify, at Yotpo, because we are selling multiple products, our philosophy is that we need dedicated resource for cross-selling with additional products, because those, on the one hand, are based on level of satisfaction that customers have based on the initial product that they used. But you need a very dedicated state of mind to approach these customers and growing them. Upsells, on the other hand, in other words, growing customers from one package to another in the same product line, is very natural for CSMs to own, because they know exactly where the customer is, what is the sentiment within the specific product, and what are the specific needs that are being collected as part of the customer journey that we are taking.